Hi there, this is Dr. John back again for another adventure in questioning and contemplation and looking into the reality of nature and life and maybe even some Chinese medicine. So I'm going to go ahead and take questions that were emailed in first, and then I will happily take any questions that you send in on the chat. That would be great. Without further ado, a couple of announcements. One, the book that Catherine and I have written it's coming out tomorrow. It's being released tomorrow. It's available now, but it is being actually physically released tomorrow. We'd love to have you purchase it, and I'd be happy to give the book away, but I need people to be verified purchasers so we can get reviews on there. Again, it's very inexpensive, but go ahead and buy the book and leave us a review. It would be really helpful and really awesome for us, and we'd really appreciate it. So that's one. Two, I've talked about a cardiovascular training class that I'm doing primarily for acupuncturists. It's a 15-week course. They're 1 hour long so that people can actually stay awake. And the class tomorrow, I think, might have fairly broad interest for lots of people. It's on bedside cardiology. Like, what are the signs and symptoms that I look at when a patient sits down in front of me? So before I take out a stethoscope, before I order any labs, before I have to ask any questions, what is it that I see on their face, in their eyes, on their ears, on their hands, on their fingernails? All of these places, every one of them, there are signs that can point to different aspects of cardiovascular disease or problems. And then we can get into the pulse taking and looking at the tongue, et cetera, which give us a massive amount of information. That class is $25. I don't have any control over it. It's run through somebody else, so I can't discount it from there. But if you want to learn about bedside diagnostics, this is a great place to start, in my opinion. That's tomorrow. You can go to our email that we've sent out today, the newsletter, and there's a place to click on the link, and it is at 3:00 tomorrow, Friday. Okay, so let's take some questions. One question that I got, curious if you could speak on antibacterial herbs like berberine and how effective they are against bacteria in the body like staph, effective enough to be substituted for antibiotics. That is a great question. I get asked that a lot by my patients. I ask myself a lot also. Obviously, I want to do what's best for my patients. And so you want to do the greatest good with the smallest amount of harm, right? That's really the ratio there that we're looking for. So we want to find herbs that are effective while they're safe. And the great news is, and I'm going to talk to this topic a little more on the next question. The great news is that Chinese herbs are incredibly safe. They've been incredibly safe for 2,000 years, but now they're even safer because the FDA has taken away from us a lot of our more powerful herbs. Now, if those herbs are used properly by an herbalist, by a doctor, then they're still extremely safe. However, in the wrong hands, people can overdose on them. Things like mahuang or ephedra. There is no herb that actually replaces the benefits of ephedra. So it's very sad that that was taken away. But it was taken away because companies started using it in weight loss programs, and a couple people died from it. And so there really is nothing that is extremely dangerous that is currently even on the market. Now, that being said, anybody can overdose on anything. Anybody can have an allergic reaction to anything. But in general, herbs are incredibly safe. Antibiotics are relatively safe. They're certainly not as safe as herbal remedies in most cases, but they are generally stronger. So if someone comes to me with a urinary tract infection and it's a burning urethra when they pee, I'll treat it with herbs. We get rid of it almost every time. I'd say 98, 99%. If it's up a little higher, it's actually in the bladder and the bladder's a little inflamed, I will still treat it with herbs, different herbs, stronger ones, and that will be successful the vast majority of the time. If people start to get any discomfort in their kidneys or they start to run a fever, then I'm going to send them in to get antibiotics immediately. Now, often they'll go in and get the antibiotics initially, even to have them on hand, but they don't want to use the strong antibiotics, so they'll use the Chinese herbs, again, which usually work, and they don't need to do the antibiotics. For single activity, singular, right? Like if you know it's staph, or you know it's strep, or you know it's gram positive or gram negative, for example, and you get it absolutely correct, then Western antibiotics are more powerful and they're more effective. They also, of course, carry more dangers because you have a lot of side effects. If you don't know what it is, often you're better off with the Chinese herbs or with both, because the Chinese herbs in a typical formula, I'm going to mention one in a few minutes, which is the most common basic antibacterial formula. What you're seeing are only 4 herbs, but each of those herbs has dozens and dozens of different alkaloids that affect the body in a variety of different ways. So you take those 4 herbs and you multiply that by dozens of different alkaloids and phytochemicals, et cetera, and you get a huge range of possibility and get a much broader course of action. So it depends on the severity of the infection. If someone has sepsis, a hospital-grade infection, unless there was nothing else available, I'm certainly not going to give them a Chinese or a Western herbal formula. I'm going to let the doctor go in and hammer them with really powerful antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, et cetera. So it's a gradation. Now, people say, well, why, why would we think that those herbs would have antibiotic activity? And the answer is kind of a duh. If you think about it, like the 4 herb combination that I'm going to mention in a minute, these are all roots. They're the Huang family, Huang, which means yellow. They're the yellow herbs that are roots. Well, if you have a root growing in your backyard, it is surrounded by trillions, not thousands, not millions, trillions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that are trying to eat it, right? And so the only way it can protect itself is to, over millennia, have developed antifungal, antiviral, and antibiotic properties. And so when you cook the herbs, provided you cook them the right way, or even if you grind them up, you're going to have these different herbal compounds that have all of those capacities. On top of that, they're going to be anti-inflammatory, and you can use them topical. Rarely need to have my patients go out for antibiotic therapy. It happens, but it's very, very unusual. A few years ago, there was a huge outbreak of MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, here in the Bay Area. I don't know if it's still out there, but I'm just not seeing those patients much lately. I see a few cases a year, but I was seeing a few cases a day 15 years ago. And a lot of it, so methicillin resistant means that one of the big guns used to treat it, the staph infection, wasn't working anymore. And I had several cases where they had used everything on these skin infections. And so I made a paste of this formula that I'm going to talk about in a moment, Huanglian Jaidutong. I mixed it with Manuka honey, and we painted it over the sore and then covered the sore with a bandaging. And in every single case, we cleared the MRSA. Doctors were stunned, absolutely stunned. I had one patient that had a very severe bacterial infection in a hip that had been, where she had a hip replacement. They couldn't get rid of the bacterial illness. And this same formula was effective against that, even though it was internal. So it can be used topically. It can be used for viruses, it can be used for antibiotics, it can be used for fungus. Now, one of the things that's really cool about that is that the biggest problem with using antibiotics is when you kill the bacteria, you set up a condition in the gut where bad bacteria can take over, as well as candida and other fungi. Well, since this is antifungal, and since it has a very broad range of antibiotics, you have a dramatically lessened likelihood of creating small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or small intestinal candida overgrowth or fungal overgrowth. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And it's nice if it's not strong enough, you get something stronger. Typically, in this Huanglian Jade Tong formula, there's one herb called Huang Qin, Qin, and Huang Qin has traditionally been used for the lungs part of this formula. It treats what's called the upper jiao, this upper area. And now there's so much research on these herbs, so much. You would be blown away if you just sat down for half a day and looked up these herbs and the studies that have been done on it. So Huang Qin has now had an extract made called Bicolin. Bicolin is a little more specific, so you don't get quite as broad a range of action, but a lot of naturopaths and functional medical doctors are now using Bicolin for all forms of lung inflammation and infection. Huanglian, and this person had mentioned berberine. Often that's in Chinese medicine, we think of that as coming from more from Huanglian. In the West, we think more from golden seal, a couple of other herbs that have very high berberine levels. However you get it, right? Now, berberine, berberine itself actually is not an herb. Berberine is an extract of one of those herbs that has a lot of berberine in it. And because of that, it doesn't have quite as broad an action as an antibacterial as the whole herb does. However, it may be the most highly studied herb, probably behind turmeric. There are hundreds of studies on berberine and using it as the equivalent of metformin in treating high blood sugars, using it as an antispasmodic, as an anti-inflammatory, all across the board. And then there's a third herb called Huang Bai, which works more on the lower jiao or the kidneys, the bladder, the urethra, etc. And so as we go down through there, the study's titled Huanglian Jade Decoction, a review on phytochemical, pharmacological, and pharmacokinetic investigations. So this would be a great thing to take a look at. And what they say is, this is an excerpt, Huanglian Jade Tong exhibits therapeutic actions in various pathological aspects, such as hyperlipidemia, that's high blood fats, tumors, it's beneficial in eliminating tumors, arthritis, sepsis, cardiac damage, liver injury, kidney disease, cerebral ischemia, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, fungal infection, and inflammation. There is no Western medication that does that. So those are the side effects. You get rid of the bacteria and you help heal all of these other things. When you get down here, it actually lowers the levels of prostaglandin E2s, which are extremely inflammatory, a big player with endometriosis and a lot of other inflammatory problems. It reduces interleukin-6, which I think is the number one interleukin chemical modifier to increase inflammation. It lowers tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha. So all the way down the line, it's doing things on so many different levels. So anyway, not quite as strong, more effective for most low-level bacterial infections. I got a question here from one of my patients. This is someone that I recommend that they do bitters. And if you remember, I had talked about bitters as a GLP-1 agonist and as a way to lower blood sugars and to lower diabetes risk. And she said, I mistakenly ended up with 2 bottles of Swedish bitters, so I'm well stocked with the stuff. But being the gloriously curious person that I am, I'm wondering if adding this might affect me adversely. I wonder not because of this article linked below, which is aimed, it seems, toward folks who are not particularly familiar with bitters in general, but because I'm more familiar with their use than some, and these are stronger than I anticipated. So then she goes on, there's a couple other paragraphs in there. Basically, this is an article from the Cleveland Clinic, and she's basically saying, what do you think about it? Is this just kind of a typical Western hit piece, or do you think there's validity? And my response was, hi, as you indicate, ignorance is often the case. First, because he said this is a traditional Chinese medical thing. First, using bitters is not a Chinese medical thing. They do feel that the bitter flavor is extremely important, but it's not a typical first way to treat digestive problems. The use of bitters is ubiquitous in Europe. Everybody does bitters. In the Netherlands, they have bitters party, where groups get together and eat and drink bitters before dinner. This is a very old tradition and a great tradition. Now, what the MD says is partly accurate. He says it starts salivation, and saliva is critical for proper digestion. He goes, that's as far as he goes. And it is because it stimulates salivary amylase in the saliva, which starts the digestive process. If you don't start the digestive process in the mouth by chewing a lot, getting a lot of saliva with the food, you rarely have complete digestion ever. I have so many people over the years that, would talk about indigestion and gas and bloating. And I said, chew your food 50 times, which they thought was insane. But most of their symptoms went away when they started chewing 50 times. Now, more importantly than the saliva, it is a GLP-1 receptor agonist. Agonist means it stimulates it, which is a critical factor in carbohydrate digestion, lowering elevated blood sugars, and assisting with weight loss. Again, GLP-1s are the newest hot thing for diabetics. You've got your drugs like Ozempic, et cetera, and people are begging for those drugs for weight loss. It typically runs about $800 a month, and like every drug out there, it can have side effects. Now, I've had patients take it that got phenomenal results and patients that took it that had very bad results. We have numerous supplements and ways and methods to stimulate GLP-1 production and to get it rolling before you eat, right? Take some bitters. It can either be the alcoholic form of bitters or the non-alcoholic version, like Swedish bitters. You take those 15 minutes to half an hour before you eat. If you have high blood sugars, then you would take some fiber. We have something called glycema core, which also is a GLP-1 agonist and has a lot of fiber. Then you eat your meal. You'll feel tremendous satiety. You won't want to eat as much, and you'll be much less inclined to snack after your meal. Way less than $800 a month. Now, again, those of you that did the liver cleanse, I spent a whole day looking at this. There are receptors for bitter. Now, it's actually the compounds that cause the bitter flavor that stimulate the bitter receptors. There are receptors for bitter throughout your entire digestive system. Thousands and thousands of receptors. You have receptors for bitter in your heart. You have receptors for bitter in your brain. You have receptors for bitter all through your intestines, large and small. Now, they're massively important for health, and the average American eats and drinks fewer bitter substances every year. Now, a lot of kids don't like vegetables. That's because they're super tasters for the bitter flavor, and they taste the bitter flavor in their vegetables. For most of us, it's not a big deal because the bitter vegetables every year get hybridized to take more and more of the bitter flavor out of them because Americans don't like it. And they suffer by becoming more and more obese and having higher and higher blood sugars. So something as simple as eating something, drinking something bitter at the beginning of your meals. And I pointed out here that it's the reason why most cultures eat their bitter leafy greens before the rest of their food, except for the French. Well, why are the French different? Because they do an aperitif or a bitters pre-meal and a salad at the end. So they get the best of both worlds. Now, a couple things that I want to address about this article. I want to dispel two enormous myths that are quite dangerous. In the Cleveland Clinic video, which you can go online and see, very well-meaning, I think they meant well, but they were totally off the mark. And the first thing that's always said in things like, what do you think about this herb? What do you think about this supplement? Oh, well, they can be very dangerous because the FDA does not approve them. Now, if you think the FDA approving something makes it safer, I have a bridge to sell you. I'll tell you, real cheap. You look at all the biggest killers that have come on the market. Celebrex. There's some argument, 40,000, 60,000 people died from Celebrex. Tylenol, the number one cause of acute, for admissions for acute liver failure, the number one cause of liver surgeries on acute situations. It is horrible for children. They still recommend it for children. I could show you dozens of studies that it is an abomination to give it to children. Aspirin, 1 year. Now they've lowered the doses now, so it's not quite so bad. There were over 10,000 deaths from aspirin. 10,000, right? Imagine how many super giant jumbo jets would have to crash to get 10,000 deaths. And yet, how many articles were there on aspirin, and how many would there have been on one airplane wreck? So the FDA approving something does not make it safer than non-FDA approved substances. Now, the FDA is required, or FDA approval is required for pharmaceuticals, and that's fine. That's fine. But it shouldn't be required for common everyday foods and supplements and vitamins, which I look every year at the Poison Hotline report. In 19 out of the last 20 years that I've looked, there were zero. That's an O, right? With a line through it sometimes. A zero deaths from vitamins, supplements, and herbs. And in every year, there were tens of thousands of deaths from FDA-approved supplement or pharmaceuticals. So FDA approval doesn't make something safer. Now, on the other hand, kind of the opposite thing is a lot of people come to the idea that all natural supplements are safe. That's total BS. The word natural, for something to be natural, has nothing to do with safety. Crocodiles are natural. I just watched a video on a 20-foot salty crocodile that could eat probably everybody listening to this podcast and would love to do so, right? So natural has nothing to do with safe. There are tons of plants that will kill you if you take one bite of them. There's a maximum safe dose for everything. Anyone can be allergic to anything, right? People die from ingesting too much water. Vitamin D for the wrong people at the too high a dose can be dangerous. Iron kills tons of people every year. So the term natural does not mean it's safe. And FDA approved does not mean it's safe. It means go to somebody that you trust to find out about these substances, right? So again, if you drink alcohol at all, the little alcoholic is fine. I think they're great. And again, this is used all through Europe. You have a little aperitif, or you have a digestif, or you have a little bitters to start the digestive process. And I highly recommend that. If you don't do any alcohol at all, then you can buy Swedish bitters at any health food store. So this is Coumarling, Kuemmerling, Coumarling, little tiny bottle, okay? You might want half a bottle, you might want a whole bottle. It's classified as a liqueur, but it is really to use as bitters. If you do that, you're going to really move forward in the weight loss lowering and blood sugar lowering categories. Okay, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Send me your questions. In a couple weeks, I'm going to do my favorite talk, which is on breast health and breast care. According to people that I trust, and they've got good evidence, fewer than 10% of breast cancers are genetic. The other 90% are lifestyle. So it begs the question, why isn't every young woman taught about this in high school? Every one of them. If it's 90% preventable, and I guarantee you it's the number one fear of my female patients, why aren't they being taught? Why aren't they being trained? So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to do a presentation on that. Lots of great pictures, lots of great information. One of my favorites. And thank you for the sweethearts, everybody. So I'll be back next week on Thursday at 3:30. Thank you. Bye-bye.